Hey everyone, thanks for coming in and thanks for tuning in again to another session of Live at MP. I'm the director of MacroPolo. For those of you who don't know me, MacroPolo is the think tank of the Paulson Institute, and we're based out of here from Chicago. And today I've got with me probably one of my favorite person to talk to, and that's Mr. Gyude Moore. He's calling in from DC. And I haven't seen Gyude for about 2 years, and he was here. He spoke at our institute about 1.5 years ago before all this, all this stuff happened. So this is my first time talking to him, and I can't wait because we've got a lot of interesting things to talk about. But let me just first tell you a little bit about Gyude. Gyude is currently a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, which is a think tank that focuses exclusively on development issues in DC. But he was formerly the Minister of Public Works in Liberia, and he was the Deputy Chief of Staff to the first and only female president of Liberia, but also of continental Africa. So he's got tons of experience, really interesting insights, and really interesting views on China, Africa, and U.S. China, Africa as well. But I'm going to start by sort of just asking Gyude. I see a really cool map back there of Africa. Love that map. And I want to set the scene a little bit because I'm not sure if everyone watching can sort of place Liberia or have a sense of how big the continent of Africa really is. So what would you, if you had to grade the average American's African geography, what would you say generously, charitably?
Oh my goodness! On a scale of 1 to 10, with
1 to 10
being terrible and 10 being great. I'm gonna go with 4.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with 4 because I think I've seen these online things where Americans struggle with continental U.S. Geography, like placing states, and so I think for Africa it'd be even worse. I know most times when you introduce it, not just Americans, but when you say Liberia, some people would be like Libya or Nigeria. It's like, no, I said Liberia. So
Liberia, just for it's Western Africa.
It is. You know how Africa sort of, it feels like South America fits into Africa, like it broke off. Well, it's in that part of Africa. That's where in the Gulf of Guinea. That's where Liberia is, and
Pangea, right? Like it did kind of break off way back.
Yeah, exactly, and drifted apart, right? Exactly.
So Brazil part kind of fits into
exactly. So supposedly it was between Recife in Brazil and somewhere in either Liberia or Senegal. I don't remember, but I think for most Americans, Liberia is really, really connected to the U.S., right? It was founded by free slaves. That's why my last name is Moore. I'm from Liberia, and my last name is Moore. It was founded by free slaves from the U.S. I'm actually from Maryland in Liberia, and Maryland.
What? There's a Maryland, and you live in
there. Yeah, it's Maryland County, but it used to be a country by itself. It was called Maryland in Africa, and it was founded by free slaves from the U.S. state of Maryland. But it was too small to survive as a country. So in 1857, it joined Liberia and became a county in Liberia. So,
fascinating. Okay, so now we've said a little bit of context: Liberia, Western Africa. But I think what people may not realize is the sheer size of the continent. I remember there was a map some people did a few years ago where they put China, U.S., India, some of the biggest countries, and they all basically fit into the continent of Africa. Just give people some idea of just how big. It really is diverse and huge.
It is a massive landmass, right? So one of the ways I try to demonstrate just the sheer size of the continent is this comparison that I make between Cape Town and Cairo. That distance is slightly over 11,000 kilometers. Now, from Berlin to Beijing by road is 9,600 kilometers. So the distance between Cape Town and Cairo is 1,400 kilometers longer than the distance between Beijing and Berlin, between Asia and Europe. And I think once you paint that picture to people, they're like, oh my goodness, it's pretty massive. It is a very, very large continent.
So that means the Silk Road is not really even that long.
No, not really.
Our south axis of Africa is almost probably longer than the Silk Road.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And there's always been this sort of a dream and a vision for Africans to build a transcontinental infrastructure system. So Cape Town to Cairo is one of them. Cape to Cairo. One of them is Lagos to Mombasa. So Cape to Cairo is north-south, and then east to west is Mombasa to Lagos. I think there are 9 highways, and we've never really gotten around to building those, but they remain on the agenda for the continent in terms of being able to interconnect the continent. Yeah.
So with the Silk Road infrastructure, and you personally had tons of experience with infrastructure, and it's one of my favorite topics to talk about. So I'm talking about my favorite topic with one of my favorite people. So it's sort of like a double whammy here. When it comes to infrastructure, and China is obviously a big part of it, and that's a lot of there's been a lot of talk and debate over China's presence in Africa. And I know you've written quite a bit on it. You've spoken on it, and I think and being in the Beltway, I know you hear a lot of different views and debate on it, or maybe not different views, but a very perhaps similar view. And I think you have a pretty different take from the prevailing view, and I'm just interested in hear you talk about.
I think mine is slightly different because so for example, I would just give you an example in terms of talking about China here in U.S. policy circles. Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, who's going to be the U.S. ambassador to the UN, gave a speech a couple of years ago at a university in college in Savannah, where she talked about the different things that China was doing in the continent, and there was a possibility, especially in a place like Africa and on development, for cooperation between the U.S. and China. She wasn't actually supporting China or anything. You can go and read the speech. But because of that, up to 20 senators voted against her, right, becoming a U.S. ambassador to the UN. So you can imagine how stringent the space is for someone who wants to talk about that. And what my platform at CGD has done is giving me an African who's actually been at the high levels of government, who's interacted with the Chinese at that level, but one who was trained here in the US too. They went to school here and remained Liberia's oldest diplomatic relationship is the UK, but then the US is not far in terms of people-to-people exchanges. So I have this platform where I can bring a completely different view in terms of China's presence on the continent. And I think that view sometimes diverges from what is generally held here in policy circles here in DC. Yeah.
So where do you come down on the whole debt trap, or I guess some people even kind of veer into the neo-colonialism sort of paradigm? I mean, where do you sit on those kinds of takes?
Oh, there's no evidence for it, right? I mean, there's like lots of studies, and Deborah Brodigan and just did a piece again in the Atlantic magazine. There's never really been this evidence that China was intentionally ensnaring its partners, into debt in the event that they can't pay. The Chinese would take over the flagship infrastructure in the country. It's just never really been evidence for that. But it's a good story to tell, though. I mean, you think about it. It's like the U.S. and China is now a peer competitor to the United States, and that building infrastructure across the world has been a significant Chinese strength. So if I were the Americans, obviously, I would definitely try to craft a narrative that will make that strength a weakness. And I think to a large extent, that's what it's become. That China's ability to build infrastructure is not so much of a strength, because if it is seen as some sort of nefarious plan to surreptitiously take over infrastructure. But no, there's really no evidence for that. And the crazy thing is, I think there is a risk, right? Because Chinese infrastructure financing is through debt. and a number of countries took more debt than they could actually sustainably service. And if COVID-19 hadn't happened, the debt crisis was coming. If you simply look at the bilateral debt stock between 2014 to 2018, China provided, say in 2014, the total Chinese bilateral debt stock, of the total bilateral debt stock, China was 45%. By 2018, China is slightly over 50%, right? So China has been the dominant actor in bilateral lending. My understanding, also research from the Center for Global Development and Aid Data, William and Mary, show that over the next 4 years, over 60% of debt servicing due on bilateral debt is to China. So China is a player in the debt issue because of the position it holds in debt. So I think there is that risk, but the idea that China is actually leveraging that risk to be able to take over infrastructure, there's no evidence for that.
Well, so on that point, a little bit tangentially related, I think last time you brought up a point that I still remember because I thought it was such a great point when you talked, was sort of the agency of African countries themselves. You know, with obviously, I think you know, U.S. China is competing and, you know, sometimes fighting in different places, but I think a lot of times you were saying how, essentially, for lack of a better term, African countries themselves aren't stupid. Right.
Oh yeah, exactly. And you know, part of the thing I've tried to in all my comments I've tried to raise is that, you know, it might seem counterintuitive, but countries, the more democratic they become, the more they turn to China, and because the pressing need in your average African country, especially sub-Saharan African country, is the need for infrastructure, right? And Chinese companies are able to provide that infrastructure at, you know, very, very competitive prices compared to European contractors, right? And the Chinese companies coming into this country sometimes come with the backing of China policy banks, right, who provide loans to be able to do that. So when we go into campaigns, one of the things we promise people as African politicians is we're going to build your infrastructure, we're going to build roads, we're going to do this. When the campaign ends and you win office, well, you need to find the financing to build that infrastructure. And the point I'm trying to make is that the thinking behind building the infrastructure has nothing to do with a great power competition, right? It's driven by domestic needs. I think it's important to understand that the foreign policy behavior of great states, small states, is the primary driver of the foreign policy behavior of any country is the domestic context. And so in most instances, what's happening within African countries and their relationship with China or with the World Bank or the US is driven by what's happening domestically.
Huh. So that's a really, really interesting and well put point. And I've thought a little bit, and I've written a little bit about this, and I wonder what you think about it, is do you think there's a sense sort of, you know, when it comes to China versus America, China being still, you know, 600 million people live on something like $5 or $10 a day, you know, less than that, you know, even poor people, that they're just less far removed from what development really entails, kind of the nitty gritty, the pragmatic aspects of development versus the United States, where it just seems like we are so far from development, you know, because we haven't been a developing country for so long that we've sort of lost a little bit of that. And I don't know what you think about that. And do you think that kind of prism, just the way in which China looks at it is quite different from the United States?
I think that's a really useful way to think about it, right? And one of the ways that I try to present this is the size of the Chinese economy in 2000, when China does its first going out, when Chinese firms begin to come to Africa the first time in the numbers we're seeing them now. The size of the Chinese economy at the time was $1.1 trillion. Right. The size of the U.S. economy at the time was $10.2 trillion, right? So China was like 1/10 the size of the U.S. economy. Africa, however, the combined GDP of the continent wasn't very far from China. China was at 1.1 trillion. Africa was about 589 billion. So we were slightly about half, right? Mm-hmm. So Chinese contractors coming to Africa at that point where they saw in Africa some of the conditions that they had seen in their lifetimes, right? In 1978, China was a poor country, right?
So like 10 years ago, they're like, oh yeah, that's
exactly. This is exactly where we were, and you know, there was this belief that with the same kind of political leadership, with the same things that we're doing with our help, we can actually get these guys up to the point where we are today, right? Obviously, that didn't play out as we would have hoped, because China is now what? 75% of the US GDP.
71%, yeah.
About 71% of the US GDP. The IMF predicts that by 2025, it'll be like 90%. And Africa is now 1/5 of China's, and the combined GDP of the continent is 1/5. So we haven't grown as fast as we could have, and China has grown significantly over this time. So I think there was that affinity, there was that recognition of what was happening in Africa, that in the lifetimes of Chinese actors on the continent, they could have seen that. And that's one. Second thing is just the perception of risk. It's completely different, right? So for a hedge fund in New York or a construction company in Henan, right? I mean, so Africa was seen as an opportunity, whereas for Western capital, Africa was seen as too dangerous a place to do business. And so the perception of Africa as too dangerous to do business, whereas for the Chinese, it was seen as a place to do an opportunity to do business. And so because of that, the first decade of Chinese presence on the continent, there was no significant rival, right? Because, and I said that in my talk, that if you were to remove the Chinese as financiers of African infrastructure, there is no like-for-like replacement, right? And so I think a part of that is that just what was the condition of the continent and the capabilities and competencies of China sort of meshed really, really well, right?
There's no.
I should point out though, quickly.
There's no substitutable country for China when it comes to infrastructure.
Yeah, but I should definitely point out that that doesn't really diminish the role of the U.S. in Africa, right? I think it's important for people to for me to point that out. That between 2003 and 2020, in 17 years, the U.S. has spent over $90 billion against a single disease, HIV/AIDS, where 12 of the 15 countries, focus countries, are in sub-Saharan Africa.
PEPFAR, right?
Yeah,
PEPFAR.
Exactly. But it's not just PEPFAR, right? The President's Malaria Initiative, right? The first budget was around 2000, 2002, 2001, was around 146 million. Last year, it was 990 million, almost $1 billion, right? So a significant number of people are alive and walking around in Africa today. They're able to go to the stadium that the Chinese built, go drive on the roads that the Chinese built, because U.S. support for health systems has been so significant. So I think this is the whole point of Africa not wanting a partner of choice, but having options in terms of its partner, because each partner has unique competencies that the continent needs. And so there's space for both the U.S. and China on the continent.
So it's been, you mentioned China's going out strategy way back, in the early 2000s. So let's say that's kind of the start of, some Chinese presence in Africa. So it's been going around for about 15, nearly 20 years now. Do you see, you hear a lot about China's presence in, East Africa, Ethiopia, and so on. Is there kind of a diffusion of it now, or is there still more concentration regionally? Is it more East Africa still concentrated versus North South? Is there any, or they're kind of more spread out these days?
No, I think China still maintains its multiple nodes of engagement, right? It's multifaceted, it's spread out, it's different sectors. What I do think is that we have to pay attention to dual circulation, right? So there is an emphasis in China now of, not so much on the heavy industries and the mines, but sort of consumption, right? And with that change in the posture of the Chinese economy, we will see a change in how China engages Africa, right? But even before dual circulation, you begin to see differences in terms of the sophistication of the Chinese economy and what it needed, right? So in my view, and I think this view is shared by others who look at it, that Africa's economic importance to China isn't as great as its political importance to China. It's a 54 block region in international fora, where at the UN or other places in China's quest for legitimacy and prestige, it is important for China to have the 54 countries or a significant number of them voting for China, right? So it gives Chinese actions, whether in Asia or elsewhere in the world, the kind of legitimacy that China requires. I think, stepping back and just looking at Chinese foreign policy, China has no natural, real ally and friends, right? In Asia, while most of China's neighbors do not want to be drawn into choosing between China and the US, there's still some sort of distrust of Chinese power, right? So there was a recent survey, and most of the respondents on the question, do you trust China to do the right thing? It was...
Yeah, I saw that. Not very high.
Exactly. So then in Europe, but we saw before that a Pew Research survey that showed that across the developed world, negative feelings toward China has basically hardened. And it was the worst they've seen in the decade they've been collecting that. So if in Asia you have this fear or sort of distrust of China, and then across the developed world you're having that, then Africa is looking more and more very, very attractive to China, right, in terms of its international prestige. So there's that change. There's also, we began to see Chinese firms investing in startups in Africa, but they ended up being like Chinese startups, right? And sort of Chinese firms attempting to replicate the stack that allowed China to be so digital across Africa. And so I think as the Chinese economy evolves and becomes more sophisticated, we're seeing that reflected in its relationship with the continent.
So that's exactly a perfect segue to go from infrastructure to technology and entrepreneurship. So obviously we know there's been a lot of consumer tech products in places like Nigeria. I think one of the most popular brands of mobile phones is a Chinese Techno, isn't it? And there are many others, brands that are not sold anywhere else but in African countries. And I think you talk about dual circulation, kind of China's looking at its domestic market. We talk a lot about China's presence in Africa, but what about the reverse? Africans, how much are Chinese training, let's say, future African entrepreneurs or technologists that bring some of that back to their home countries?
So the extent, so African traders, right? African traders discovered China. They probably did on their own.
It's pretty big. It's hard to miss China.
Exactly.
A lot of Chinese people, so
And they began to bring in a significant amount of Sorry, I was muted for a minute there.
5 seconds.
Yeah. African traders began to bring in a lot of finished goods to the continent, and it ended up being cheaper, right, in terms of the market. And there's been an increasing number of African students studying in China. I just saw a report in The Economist that said that when the pandemic struck, there were over 80,000 African students studying in China. China has been providing massive scholarships there. The difference, though, is that if an African student studies in the US, there's OPT and optional practical training, like they could stay here and practice. There isn't an equivalent in China. So Chinese entrepreneurs are across the continent. I mean, starting businesses. There was a McKinsey report that showed 10,000 Chinese firms, and a third of manufacturing occurring on the continent was done by Chinese firms. That hasn't translated in terms of African presence in China, and so maybe it's something that's worth looking into. But again, I think I should point out that there is a bit of tension on that front.
Okay.
Because for Africa to grow its average income, for the GDP to grow, we have to do some sort of value addition, some sort of manufacturing, even if it's light manufacturing. So the presence of cheap Chinese finished goods sort of provides really, really stiff competition for nascent manufacturing in Africa. So yeah, China is a significant partner, but in that realm, China could be a competitor, right? Especially now that African countries are trying to create this continental free trade area and allow intra-Africa trade. So it's a partner and it could be a competitor.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point because China just strangely competitive on various segments of the value chain. Like if you look at East Asia, you start making socks and shoes, right? And that's how you make that, and then light manufacturing, textiles, and then you climb up. But then China can still make shoes and socks, and then you're like, what are we going to do? They make
what is left for us, right? Exactly.
So,
but even then also is that so China now accounts for almost 50% of the demand for mining products. So a significant portion of African mineral products are shipped to China to be processed there, right? So we're not even smelting any ores. We're not doing anything. So China is like everywhere in the value chain. And over time,
cobalt's a big deal from the Congo.
Exactly. Or even chrome that is used in steel, out of South Africa is mostly processed in China. So if China is present in every segment of the value chain, then for Africans looking to rise up in the value chain, you're like, it's, at some point there's going to be this competition with China.
That's a really interesting paradox. That's really interesting. So I know, going back a little bit to tech, I know you're interested personally in AgTech. Tell me a little bit about that. Why food? I mean, I understand why food, but why AgTech? What's the potential?
Well, I think, and if we look at East Asia and just look at Japan, look at China, and you go from agriculture, you go from large scale agriculture in terms of being able to produce a surplus, right? And then the savings from the agriculture sort of bleeds into other segments of the economy. So we keep praising ourselves of having 60% of undeveloped arable land that's left in the world, but we're still importing significant amounts of food. I think by 2025, it should be up to $100 billion that we're importing in terms of food that's coming into the continent. So there is a massive unmet, demand for African products, especially when we're in that. So food is important. But I think you can connect the sort of the industrial journey of countries from food production, from agro-processing to more complex manufacturing. So if we want to go in there, I think food production is really, really important. And so AgTech that allows us to increase yields, that allows us to be able to detect diseases before they occur and wipe out the harvest, those kinds of things are going to be really, really useful if we go into the large-scale infrastructure that agriculture that we're looking to see in Africa.
Do various African countries, well, I'm sure it's pretty diverse, but are there regulations on GMOs, those kinds of things yet, or not? Not really?
Yeah, I think so. The one African country that's actually gone far with it is Burkina Faso with cotton. But then there was an issue with the thread in terms of the length of the GMO thread, and I think it was suspended for a while. I know I spent all of 2019 on the continent talking about genetically edited mosquitoes to prevent malaria, right? So we had this conversation. So, for example,
CRISPR.
That's right. In Uganda, they've been doing all kinds of tests on GMOs for different food products, but they've never really approved any for general use. So I think that remains an issue on the continent. Yeah.
All right. In the interest of time, I want to end on something that's a little bit. Remember, we have a beyond part, right? China, Africa, and beyond.
Sure.
I remember we were talking. You were recently in Japan not too long ago, and you visited Japan, and I think we both agree that China and Japan are probably two of the most different, despite the fact that they're both East Asian. They're very different countries. And what was your impression of Japan versus?
So I went to Japan twice. I went to Japan twice. The second time I spent the longest I spent there. It was like 15 days. And then I went to China once, but I stayed longer in China. And I guess one of the big differences is that Japan is just way too clean, right? Japan is unusually
it's intensely clean, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like China is clean, like Beijing's clean. I mean, especially where we were staying, but it's kind of like normal clean.
It's like clean. It's like it's still a city, right?
Exactly. But Japan is like, because I always have an eye for public infrastructure. I thought, in my travels, it was the best I've seen in terms of public infrastructure, not just in the quality, but in terms of the maintenance and cleanliness, right? And but then the second thing about Japan also, maybe it's just a reflection of where we were staying. It made me really, really you couldn't deny that you were in an Asian country, right? And then when people went to work, they kind of looked alike when they went to work. I felt self-conscious. I stood out, I thought.
Yeah.
But in Beijing, I felt like there was enough diversity, even among Chinese people. But then it could also be just the part of Beijing we were, right? Because if you go to Silk Street, Silk Road, there's this place where people buy.
Oh, the Silk Market, yeah, where there's like
exactly. Or if you go to Nanjing in Shanghai, right? It's like, it's completely different. But I just felt like in Beijing there was the homogeneity wasn't as striking as it was, in Japan. However, I also thought like in Japan people were. I was like, just generally more accommodating, and like, the hustle bustle wasn't like, in Beijing, it was like, in a way, Japan is like, it's really proper, like clean and proper. And Beijing is like, it's like,
it's a
gritty.
bit
not gritty, but like,
like Tokyo is like, for such a big city, it's like, if you think about it really hard, it's really quiet.
It is. It is.
Big city. Beijing is loud. Like you hear cars.
No, Beijing is like it's happening, man. It's happening.
It like hits
but
you.
It was for me. Infrastructure. I'm there's probably places in the world that haven't have better infrastructure than Japan. I just thought public infrastructure in Japan was just world class. I loved it, but I enjoyed my time there.
Well, Gyude, I can talk to you for another 3 hours, but I want to be respectful for your time, and maybe we'll do this.
Absolutely.
But this is really fun, and I'm glad we could cover the gamut on China, Africa, and also a little bit of East Asian comparisons.
Absolutely.
Let's do this some more in the future.
Let's do it again. Thank you very much for having me, Damien. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.
All right. Take care. Bye.